I love animation. Like a lot of people, I fell in love with animation as a kid, through television, anime, and indie animation. As I grew older and as animation kept on getting better and better over the years, my interest for this medium would only continue to grow. This interest would grow so much to the point where I would eventually try making my own. What started with casual stick figure fights would eventually evolve into more anime-inspired designs, with action and fight scenes being my main interest. And while I was certainly passionate for animation, like a lot of artists, I struggled with getting my projects to come out exactly how I envisioned them. Hell, even just finishing my projects was a huge uphill battle. And as a kid whose motivations were primarily tied to the final outcome, having it come out not as good as I had imagined would definitely be why I was so on and off with my progress. It was this cycle of trial and error that would repeat for several years, where I would have months of focused work and modest improvements, followed immediately by months of not even touching an art program. And as the years went past with unfinished projects piling up and visions of animation heights I could only dream of achieving, it wouldn't be long until my passion for animation would be tested for the very first time. Enter my senior year of high school, and it's about time that I start thinking about my future, specifically what I wanted to pursue post-graduation. It was after a little bit of consideration that I would challenge myself to try and make it into one of the most competitive and difficult undergraduate programs in the world, with less than a 9% acceptance rate and often referred to as the Harvard of animation. I would be attempting to make it into Sheridan's animation program. If you'd like to know the level of animation that this program reaches, here are some notable graduates alongside some projects that they worked on. Dami Shi, who wrote and directed Turning Red, as well as won an Academy Award for her Pixar short Bao. Dean DuBois, who co-wrote and directed Disney's Lilo and Stitch, as well as wrote and directed the entire How to Train Your Dragon trilogy. Chris Williams, who co-directed Moana, won an Oscar for directing Big Hero 6, and recently wrote and directed Netflix's The Sea Beast. These are all Sheridan graduates, and some of the most well-known and famous animated works from the past decade are all the result of these individuals. And there are so many more beautiful animated films that resulted from Sheridan graduates. So yeah, you could say that Sheridan was the highest of ceilings to shoot for. And so on November 21st, I would officially be attempting to make it into this program myself. With the application submitted and all payments completed, all that was left to do was make a portfolio with minimal drawing experience, no practice in majority of the portfolio requirements, and only 3 months to finish, starting from scratch. I might have just bitten off more than I could chew.
Oh, brother, this guy stinks!
With only around 3 months left, I needed to get my priorities in check. I had until February 19th to completely finish this portfolio. So the first thing I did was check what was required for this year and what was different from previous years. Going into this, I actually had access to a collection of previously submitted portfolios, so I wasn't going in completely blind. During the weeks leading up to this year's requirements, I had taken note of the sections that showed up consistently across several years. Over 3 different portfolio periods, the same 7 sections would show up again and again. Figure drawings, hand drawings, character rotation, short animation, storyboard, perspective line drawings, and finally, a personal section. Prior to my comparison, the only differences I found between years were the prompts for the short animation and storyboard. But that was to be expected. Apart from that minor difference, everything was the same across every year. So, coming up to the official requirement release, I was confident that I had a concrete list in hand. until I didn't. One of my most confident areas going into this was the hand section. I had done some practice prior because of how difficult other artists had claimed drawing hands were, so I had made it my priority to practice even before the list had come out. And it would be just my luck to find out that for the very first time in nearly 2 decades would they be removing hands from their mandatory list. I was devastated. I had considered my hand drawings to have not only improved to the point where they were decent, but to where they would have been one of the strongest points on my portfolio. But now that the section was entirely removed, I was left scrambling for a bit. Thankfully, apart from the removal of the hand section, there weren't many other changes. The other sections hadn't been touched, and the only other major difference was how everything was graded. Since a whole category had been removed, there were a lot of marks that needed to be moved around to fill in that gap. So a lot of those points moved to the personal section, with it now taking up a quarter of the total marks. Looking at the situation positively, that still meant that 5 of the 7 categories had relatively remained untouched. So my deep dive into the other portfolios and previous studies wouldn't be going to waste. For the entirety of December and January, I worked on my fundamentals. Most of the time I had before submission were spent filling in major gaps of knowledge in said fundamentals. During my practice, there was one section in particular that I was especially struggling with, and that was the character rotation. Sheridan likes a more cartoony style that follows Western style animation and prioritizes accuracy on the rotation over anything else. Based on my previous research into other accepted portfolios, the variations in both simplicity and cartoon varied a lot. So figuring out a good balance on how cartoony and how detailed my character should be led to this section being one of the most difficult out of the bunch. This also meant that on a technical note, this was the first full body character I had ever made. And speaking of, there were so many firsts that occurred during these 2 months. On top of it being my first full body character and character rotation, it would also be my first time doing figure drawings, storyboard, and perspective drawings. I had a lot of catching up to do. And even though I was struggling with the character rotation, I pushed through to make a rough version as quick as possible, which allowed me to move on and start practicing some of the other categories. I didn't want to have any category unpracticed and left for the end, so I cycled through every section to make sure that I had at least a couple of roughs to work with. This process would quickly eat up whatever time I had for the next 2 months, and by the end of January, I had accumulated a bunch of new skills. Thankfully, just in the nick of time too, as I would apparently be utilizing these skills a lot sooner than I anticipated. I may have forgotten a very important piece of information that would send me on a very tiny detour. While Sheridan was the end goal and the tip of the mountain of this whole journey, there were other schools that I had applied for as well. But due to how far behind I was on Sheridan's portfolio, I had become completely tunnel visioned and had forgotten about any other school's portfolios. So when I was reminded of Seneca's portfolio submission, I panicked. Looking at the date, it was January 27th. The due date for Seneca was February 1st. Immediately, I looked for things that I could use from my Sheridan practice for Seneca's portfolio. Unfortunately, there wasn't anything that I could use directly from my rough drafts, so a large majority of the pieces would have to start from scratch. All except for 2. While the situation was definitely looking very bad, there was one particular light shining down this very dark tunnel. On top of having a much smaller portfolio size, Seneca also still had their hand section. And guess who had a backlog of hand structure drawings ready to go? With this advantage, my confidence started to rise. After spending about an hour polishing my chosen hand drawings, I immediately moved on to object drawings. My first attempt was of a box cutter, which did come out alright, but ended up scrapping later. Overall, the proportions and details came out pretty good, but it lacked any significant 3D aspect. So I restarted, going with a computer mouse instead. This time, I made sure there was more of an angle, emphasizing the 3D and making sure there was clear underlying structure to it. This one went fairly smoothly, with the first take being the one I would later end up submitting. The second object gave me a little more trouble than I thought. It was a fairly simple object, being a pencil sharpener, but for whatever reason, I struggled quite a bit on the perspective on this one. It took me multiple attempts to realize that what I was going for wasn't working. So on my fourth attempt, I played into the foreshortening aspect, which I wasn't even sure was allowed, but I went with anyway. With that done, I had now completed both my hand drawings as well as my object drawings 2 days in. 2 days in with 4 drawings down. I was on fire. But then I hit my first major roadblock, figure drawing. Figure drawing was torture. I could care less about perspective, proportion, anatomy, or whatever other things I studied. It all paled in comparison to figure drawing. To have any hopes of getting any decent figure drawings, I would need to attend a class. Thankfully, there was a studio that I was able to go to get some figure drawing practice, but I had no time, so whatever I was able to draw there was whatever I was going to be able to submit. With only 3 hours per class available, I would have to really maximize my time, but this meant that I didn't have all day to work on figure drawings, and I would ultimately not end up choosing my final 2 figure drawings until the day of submission. So in the meanwhile, when I wasn't at the studio grinding out figure drawings, I would have to work on my perspective drawings. With only around 24 hours left to do them, I had to really pick up the pace. My first drafts came out alright, but needed more life, more details. So I made some last minute changes to my drawings, and due to the time, I had to submit whatever I had. Thankfully, they looked alright, and I think pretty accurately portrayed the same room from 2 different angles, which was the end goal. Looking back at it now, I could definitely see some very obvious mistakes that I had made, but with only a couple of hours before the deadline, I would have to go along with what I had. It was also here that I took the final pictures of the figure drawing poses I would go with, and it was down to 2 personal works. And here again, I was cursed with having done no personal artworks beforehand suitable for a portfolio. So I coughed up a rough character rotation I had for Sheridan and a sketchbook page of hands to submit. As I laid out all my drawings, I went through my checklist to make sure I had everything, with 2 full body figure drawings, 2 hand drawings, 2 object drawings, 2 room drawings, and 2 personal pieces all ready to go. I pressed the submit button and sat back in my seat. I had just finished my first ever portfolio. After submitting Seneca's portfolio and getting some sleep, I woke up the next day motivated. And perfectly timed too, because although I had just grinded for days with minimal breaks, I was still not done. My next challenge was right in front of me. Another school's animation program I had applied for was OCAD's. OCAD's experimental animation portfolio deadline was February 10th. It was now February 1st. However, this time, I had actually known that this portfolio deadline was coming. But because of a tiny diversion, I had 5 less days to work with than I thought. But this portfolio was a little different than the others. While both Sheridan and Seneca's both had specific requirements and pieces they were checking for, OCAD simply wanted 10 finished pieces, regardless of if it shows you no structure or fundamentals. It also helped if you submitted pieces that covered different art mediums, as it is an experimental animation program. Unfortunately, again, my lack of art pieces meant I had to stick with whatever I had currently, so my pool of art mediums was very limited. Thankfully, I was able to reuse some of the pieces I had used in my Seneca portfolio, so some of my work was already done for me. I snagged both of the room drawing perspectives, a hand drawing, as well as the character rotation. Since I didn't really have to make any specific pieces for this portfolio, and could really use any finished piece I had, I scrapped up some stuff I did for art class in school and used those. The first was a graphite drawing of a skull, which was actually my first ever attempt at graphite. And it still is, as I haven't done another graphite drawing since. Alongside my old graphite skull, I also used a very rough animation I did for a volleyball sequence. Considering that I wanted to apply for an animation program, I thought that adding no animation sequences at all would be quite silly. Now this was by far my most questionable piece, as it is unbelievably rough, with no polish and sometimes no clear understanding of what's happening. It was a huge gamble to even submit it. But considering it was meant to be a study on exaggeration and impact, of which the animation does manage to display, I could only hope that the reviewers would overlook the roughness of the work and divert their focus on the main point of the study. But still, this was by far my most unconfident piece I ended up submitting in this portfolio. During the next couple days, I would also work on a couple more figure drawings, hoping for some better ones I could submit than the ones I used for Seneca. And in the end, I do believe that my figures got significantly better. With the figure drawings added, that was already 8 of 10 pieces done. The next piece I chose was also a school art project, but for privacy concerns, I won't be displaying it here. With all of this done, I was actually left with a considerable amount of time before the deadline, give or take 3 days. And with so much time in my hands, I decided to experiment with my final piece. It had been a very long time since I had even attempted an illustration. My latest one was one I had done 3 years prior, when I had first gotten my first drawing tablet. Ever since then, I hadn't even considered making another illustration. But not only had my skills significantly improved since then, I had also come to understand what I wanted my drawings to look like too. With new inspiration and motivation, as well as not being pressured by time, making this illustration felt very different. It felt so freeing to be able to draw what I wanted, with no restrictions or requirements applied. After around 2 days, I had finished. In the end, it wasn't everything I could have hoped for. The cards were still not detailed at all and can't even really be defined as cards. But at that point, I had less than a day left and I still needed to get my sketchbook requirement done. So considering my final piece good enough, I moved on to the last requirement for OCAD's portfolio. The sketchbook went by quick, literally just took a couple of pages of old roughs and some digital sketches I had and compiled them all into one PDF to submit. And with that, on February 10th, 3:30 a.m., on the day of OCAD's portfolio deadline, I finalized my second submission. Here it was, the final 10 days. 10 days until the big one was here. All of my efforts, my time spent practicing, the hours spent grinding, it had all led up to these final days. And with the most important and necessary time to be locked in, I couldn't draw. Now, I'm not an artist. I don't think I've drawn nearly enough to be able to consider myself one. But I know of artist terms, one of which being art block, a temporary rut where one struggles with motivation, inspiration, and producing or finishing art. Due to my lack of prolonged drawing in the past, I was spared of having to go through an art block up to this point. And unfortunately, I think I was about to go through an art block for the very first time at the worst time possible. If I were to describe this feeling, it would be like being unable to move my body but being fully conscious at the same time. So basically paralyzed. Even though I knew that I had to draw, I just couldn't. My motivation was shot. Both my physical ability to draw as well as my mental desire to draw was completely gone. Whatever art pieces I had left to finish went untouched for almost 5 days. And once more, to my absolute and utter horror, I was left with 5 days to finish what was my most anticipated and grueling challenge. The problem was, even after giving myself around 5 days to rest to try and get back into the right mental state, I was definitely still going through this block. But I had no other choice but to push through it. I still had a lot of work left to do, and couldn't really risk taking any more days off. I did have somewhat of an advantage though. Unlike the other portfolios, I had been working on this one. In fact, it was the one and only thing I had been working to get better at over the last couple of months. So I was not only going in knowing exactly what I was doing for once, but I was also decently prepared. All I had to do was finalize some pieces. So with whatever strength and willpower I had left, I started piecing together what would be my final portfolio. The first thing I had to prioritize was the storyboard. And if figure drawing was torture before, this storyboard was hell. My god, did I struggle with this storyboard. And the worst part was, I knew that the storyboard was where people lost the most marks, and yet I still decided to procrastinate it until the end. I guess I was about to face the consequences of my actions, because that night I would proceed to pull an all-nighter just to get this done. It did help a little bit that I had practiced drawing the character beforehand, but due to my time constraint, I had to leave a lot of the backgrounds undetailed, which I knew would cost me quite a bit of marks. But unless I wanted to submit this storyboard and nothing else, I would have to move on and finalize the other pieces of my portfolio. The next thing I worked on were my perspective line drawings. You might notice that one of the drawings looked a little familiar to one of my other submissions. But to be fair, I was short on time and I had to improvise where I could. The exterior drawing I had actually completed a while back, so that was already my line drawings done. Following up with some more easy stuff was my character rotation. The past two portfolios had used a rough version of the same character rotation I was already making, so all I had to do was add some minor changes and finishing touches, which did not take very long at all. My next obstacle was short animation, making sure to exaggerate the movement, adding necessary squash and stretch, and staying accurate to the character model. I had managed to get the short animation done after another all-nighter. By this point, I was pushing through 2 all-nighters and had little less than a day before the final portfolio deadline. I was at the final stretch. It was finally February 19th. The last couple of hours I had left were now counting down. After taking photos of all my figure drawings, I had accumulated them all into one drive, so it all came down to selection. After combing through the best ones, I selected the 2 long poses and 2 short poses I needed and finalized figure drawings for the very last time. The very last thing I needed now was the sketchbook. By this point, I was beyond exhausted. I had been up for a little under 72 hours, and my will to even keep my eyes open was fading. So with whatever willpower I had left, I scrapped together what would be my last sketchbook submission, and finally had all of the pieces of my final portfolio done. As I waited for the final pieces to finish uploading, my finger hovered above my mouse, waiting to click the button that had been fueling me for the past several months. The final step to end this wild adventure I had started. As I watched the final piece get successfully uploaded, I took a deep breath as I turned the final page of this journey. I love animation and visions of animation heights I could only dream of achieving and make it into one of the most competitive and difficult undergraduate programs. I had just finished my first ever portfolio. I would officially be attempting to make it into this program myself. I had just submitted my final portfolio for the #1 animation program in the world. Now that all of the deadlines and portfolios are all behind me, all I'm left with are some final thoughts. The first thing I want to get out of the way is what I think happened during my last stretch for Sheridan. I think that my motivation got shot purely because of my success with the other portfolios. Due to my final submissions with both Seneca and OCAD, I think I lulled myself into a false sense of security. And I think it was this nudge into relaxation that triggered the art block, where one thing led to another and I just didn't feel like drawing anymore. Now, I also feel like I blamed art block a lot for my shortcomings on the Sheridan portfolio. But I need to take more accountability here. Simply put, I should have started earlier and drawn more. That's really all there is to it. And because of that, even though I had known about this almost a year prior, I still ended up falling short. Or at least I think. Who knows? Maybe by the grace of God I managed to get in. I can only hope. But in the end, as difficult and as challenging as it was, I've come to love drawing to a whole new degree. I actually have a want to draw, this will to bring my ideas to life, of which I was desperately missing before. And for that alone, if I had the chance to go back and do this all over again, I would, without hesitation. With how much I've improved and this newfound love for art, I'm excited to see where my art journey will take me.